Hello, I am Anshuman Bora. I welcome you to this second week of MOOC on oral history. Today, we'll discuss on the topic conventional history writing and its limitation. This lecture is crucial to understanding how our ideas of history were shaped, what they include, and more importantly, what they often leave out. History, as we usually imagine it, comes to us in the forms of books, official records, and grand narratives of kings, wars, and empires. These narratives, which we call conventional history, have dominated our understanding of the past for centuries. They form the foundation of how modern societies remember and interpret human experience. But history is not just about what happened, it is also about who gets to tell the story. And as E.H. Carr famously reminded us in his classic work, What is History? History is a continuous dialogue between the past and the present. It is not a mere collection of facts, it's a process of interpretation which is deeply influenced by the historian's perspective and by the society in which they live. Conventional history writing emerged in Europe during the Enlightenment and became institutionalized through the 19th century. It was during this period that history came to be seen as a science of facts. It claimed objectivity, neutrality, and verification through written sources. The role of the historian was imagined to be as a detached observer who could present what actually happened, free from emotion or bias. While this method produced many significant works of scholarship, it created boundaries. Boundaries about what could be considered legitimate history and what could not. The written word became the ultimate proof of the past. Cultures which relied on oral transmission, storytelling, and performance were often dismissed as prehistoric or ahistorical. As a result of this, a large section of human experience, especially those of indigenous people, women, peasants, and marginalized groups, were pushed to the margins of historical consciousness. Their memories, songs, rituals, and oral traditions were treated as folklore or myths, but not as history. The purpose of this lecture is to understand how this happened, how a particular way of writing history came to dominate the world's understanding of the past, and to examine the consequences of such a dominance, especially in regions like Northeast India, where memory often lives not in archives but in the voices of the people. We'll first trace the origins of conventional history writing, examine its main features, and then move on to discuss its inherent limitations. By the end of this lecture, we'll have a clearer understanding of why history needs to be read critically and why alternative ways of remembering and recording the past, such as oral and indigenous narratives, are so essential in creating a more inclusive historiography. To understand the limitations of conventional history, we first need to understand where it comes from, the ideas that shaped it, and the values which guided it. Conventional history writing, as we know it today, originated in 18th and 19th century Europe. It was a product of the Enlightenment, a period which valued reason, science, and empirical observation above all else. Historians during this time believed that history should be studied with the same rigor as the natural sciences. The belief was simple but very powerful, that the past could be known through facts and that these facts could be discovered, verified, and arranged in a linear, objective narrative. The duty of the historian, therefore, was to collect evidence, analyze it, and present it as the truth. This approach was deeply influenced by the philosophy of positivism, which suggested that truth exists outside human interpretation and that it can be uncovered through observation and rational inquiry. Positivism brought precision and discipline in the study of history, but it also introduced an important an assumption that the historian is neutral, detached, and unaffected by personal or cultural biases. This vision of the historian as an impartial observer was further reinforced by European thinkers like Leopold von Ranke, who famously had declared that the purpose of history was to show the past as it actually happened. Such an aspiration was indeed admirable, but it often ignored the fact that no historical record is entirely free from interpretation. The rise of archives and institutions in 19th century Europe also contributed to shaping the discipline. Governments, colonial administrations, and universities began collecting and storing a vast amount of written material, like official documents, letters, decrees, and reports. These were treated as the most reliable evidence of the past. Thus, the archive itself became a symbol of authority and legitimacy. When European colonial powers expanded across the world, they brought with them the ways of knowing and writing history. The colonial administrators, scholars, and missionaries applied the same methods to the colonies. They collected texts, classified the people, and recorded the customs, all within a framework which saw Europe as a standard of civilization. As historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued in Provincializing Europe, colonial historiography not only recorded the past of others, but also redefined it through European categories of time, progress, and rationality. What it meant is that the cultures without written scripts, or those which did not record their past in textual form, were seen as lacking history altogether. In India, this approach deeply influenced the way history was written during and after the colonial period. The British administrators depended on Persian chronicles, the royal edicts, and administrative records, while the oral traditions, the songs, and the myths of the local communities were often dismissed as unreliable. The very act of writing history thus became an exercise of power. It decided what counted as history and knowledge and who had the right to preserve it. Conventional historiography, therefore, was not just a method, it was a worldview. It defined history as something which is written, verified, and stored in archives, something which belonged to the states, the kings, and empires. It assumed that the past must be linear and progressive, moving from primitive to civilized, from local to the national, from the myth to history. This form of history writing gave rise to what we now call mainstream or official history. History which emphasizes on written documents, political events, and elite actors. It became the dominant narrative, shaping our textbooks, institutions, and even collective memory. Now that we have traced the origins of conventional history writing, let's look at its defining features, the principles and practices which shaped how historians wrote, interpreted, and legitimized the past. These features, although influential, sowed the seeds of exclusion, particularly of the voices and traditions which existed beyond the written word. The first and perhaps the most defining feature of conventional historiography is dependence on written records. Historians worked within this framework and considered only those sources which could be verified in textual form, like official documents, manuscripts, royal decrees, treaties, or literary works, as authentic, objective, and reliable. In contrast, the oral testimonies, the folk tales, the songs were viewed as imprecise, emotional, and unscientific. This bias automatically excluded the histories of the non-literate societies. As John Tosh has pointed out, this obsession with documentation gave history a sense of authority, but it also confined the discipline to the voices of those who had the power to write. In colonial India, this meant that British officers and local elites became the chief narrators of history, while the peasants, the women, and the indigenous groups remained unheard. Another hallmark of conventional historiography is the preference for chronology and political events. History was written as a linear sequence of events, a story of progress from the past to the present. Wars, successions, treaties, and reforms were treated as milestones which defined historical time. This approach gave rise to what E.H. Carr has called event-based model of history. The historian's focus remained on great men and their great deeds. As a result of this, the everyday lives of ordinary people, their labor, their rituals, their relationships with nature were very rarely documented. Such a model of history produces what we call a top-down narrative, which flows from the rulers to the ruled, from the state to the people, from the center to the margins. The third major feature is a claim to objectivity. Historians of the positivist era believed that they could record the past without emotion or bias, that history is a pure science of facts. However, post-colonial scholars like Ranajit Guha and Linda Tuhiwai Smith have pointed out that this very claim of neutrality is masking the historian's own cultural and political standpoint. For instance, colonial historians often described the indigenous communities as primitive, barbaric. They believed themselves to be objective observers. However, their interpretation reflected their imperial ideologies and not their detached analysis. As Dipesh Chakraborty reminds us, objectivity in such contexts becomes a form of epistemic control, a way by which one's own worldview becomes universal and rational. The fourth key feature is the reliance on state-controlled archives. Foucault had described archives as a system of statements which define what can be said. In other words, we can say that the archives are not neutral, they are products of power. The official records preserved in these archives reflected the perspectives of those who were in authority. The voices of the peasants, the women, the minority groups very seldomly enter these collections. For example, in the context of India, the colonial administrators documented rebellions, land revenue, and treaties, but they ignored the oral traditions which recorded how the communities perceived the very same events. Thus, what survives in the archives is not the totality of the past, it's a curated and selective version of the past. Finally, conventional historiography tends to create singular and unified narratives. It seeks coherence, a single national, religious, or civilizational story. However, in doing so, it often suppresses the diversity and plurality of human experiences. In regions like Northeast India, what this has meant is that the many ethnic histories, the oral genealogies, and migratory memories were being absorbed in broad administrative or national categories like tribe, frontier, or periphery. These simplifications create an illusion of unity, but it erases the nuances of the local cultures. As Sanjeev Borua had observed, the history of the region was often written not from within, but from the outside, by the colonial officers, the missionaries, and later by the metropolitan scholars. Each had their own lens of interpreting the past. So to summarize, we can say that conventional historiography is built upon 5 pillars. Firstly, the primacy of written sources. Secondly, its event-centered and chronological structure. Thirdly, its ideal for objectivity. Fourthly, its dependence on archives and other institutions of power. And fifthly, its drive towards a singular, homogenized narrative. Each of these features gave this discipline its authority, but also created exclusions. Now, having understood the major features of conventional history writing, we can now look at its limitations. The reasons why this method of writing history, while rigorous, remains incomplete in its understanding of the human past. These limitations are not only technical, they're conceptual, political, and ethical. They determine whose voices were being heard and whose voices were forgotten. Perhaps the most significant limitation of conventional historiography is its exclusion of the non literate societies. By equating history with the written word, conventional historians have created a boundary between those who had history and those who supposedly did not. Communities which preserve their past through songs, myths, or oral genealogies were often dismissed as primitive or prehistoric. This approach erased entire civilizations from the historical record. It also reflected a Eurocentric belief that progress was tied to literacy, writing, and documentation. The rich oral traditions of various communities were treated as folklore, not as valid historical sources. However, these oral narratives contain detailed information about migration, ecology, kinship, and resistance, aspects which were often ignored by the colonial archives. As the historian Jan van Sina has observed, oral traditions are not inferior to written records. They are simply different forms of memory, which require different methods of interpretation. The neglect of oral sources, therefore, is not just a methodological gap, it's a form of cultural marginalization. The second limitation lies in the elitist bias of conventional history. As historians relied heavily on written and official records, the narratives often reflected the viewpoints of the kings, the administrators, and the elites. The history of the laborers, artisans, women, and peasants were very seldomly recorded, and when they were, it was through the eyes of those in power. As Ranajit Guha has pointed out in his subaltern studies, colonial and nationalist histories both tended to speak for the people rather than from the people. This created a historical consciousness which was top down, state centric, and male dominated. For example, the Ahom Buronzis are recognized as formal chronicles, but the oral histories of the elders of communities like the Misings or Rabhas, which also narrate stories of migration, agriculture, community governance, are very rarely treated with equal seriousness. This biasness has reinforced a false notion that history is made only by rulers and recorded only in palaces and archives. The third limitation is epistemic control. Control over how knowledge itself is defined. During the colonial period, the British scholars and administrators constructed Indian history through European frameworks of time and rationality. Such an approach treated Indian and indigenous modes of remembering as myths or legend, thereby establishing Western epistemology as the only valid form of knowledge. Even after independence, many post-colonial historians continued to use these frameworks. They replaced the colonial narrative with a nationalist one, but the structure of exclusion often remained the same. As Dipesh Chakraborty notes, the nationalist historiography of India sought to unify the nation's past, but in the process of doing so, it subsumed the regional, the ethnic, and the local. Thus, epistemic control continued, only under a new banner, the banner of the modern nation state. The fourth limitation rises from the over-reliance on archives as the ultimate authority of truth. As said before, Foucault had said, archives are not neutral repositories, they are instruments of power. They preserve what those in authority consider worth remembering, and they discard what does not serve that purpose. In the context of India, the colonial archives have meticulously recorded taxation, land settlements, and administrative correspondences. But they very rarely document how these policies affected the daily lives of ordinary people. The local narratives, the protest songs, and the oral testimonies might have told a very different story, but they were left outside the walls of the archive. What this means is what we often call official history is not a mirror of a past. It is selective reflection which is shaped by institutional priorities. The archive then does not only preserve, it also silences. Another major limitation of conventional historical history is its linear and teleological view of time. History in this view is imagined as a straight line, which moves from the ancient to the modern, from primitive to civilized, from darkness to enlightenment. But the indigenous societies do not perceive time in this way. For many of these societies, historical consciousness is cyclical and relational. It's linked to nature, seasons, ancestors, and rituals. For example, an indigenous community may connect their historical identity with specific landscapes, sacred groves, and ritual journeys. Their sense of time is embedded in the land and the rhythm of their collective life, rather than in dates and events. When we impose a linear chronology on such worldviews, we tend to distort them by forcing them to fit a model for which was never theirs to begin with. These limitations have had serious consequences. They have led to what we might call the threefold distortion of history: erasure, misrepresentation, and marginalization. Erasure, that is, when the voices of the non literate communities were completely left out of historical narratives. Misrepresentation, that is, when their traditions were recorded through external or colonial frameworks, not with their own framework, and tinged with moral or racial judgments. And marginalization, that is, when their histories are treated as peripheral footnotes to a larger national story. These distortions have also affected public policy and collective identity. Misreadings of ethnic histories may also lead to cultural misunderstandings, social hierarchies, and even political conflicts. Thus, the limitations of conventional history are not merely academic concerns. They shape how societies see themselves and how they're seen by others. To fully understand the limitations of conventional history writing, we must examine how these limitations played out in specific regions. One of the most striking examples is Northeast India, which is home to more than 200 distinct ethnic communities, each with its own language, culture, and historical memory. For generations, these communities preserved the past, not through written texts, but through oral traditions, ritual practices, songs, dances, genealogies, and sacred landscapes. But most mainstream histories of India, both colonial and nationalist, have failed to recognize them as legitimate historical sources. Why did this happen? For a long time, the history of Northeast India was written not by its own people, but by the colonial administrators, the missionaries, the anthropologists, and later by the metropolitan scholars. These external observers viewed the region through a lens of frontier, tribe, primitive, or backward. Such labels were not neutral descriptions. They're tools of classification and control. Colonial writers often described practices like headhunting, shifting cultivation, or other ritual practices as signs of savagery, without understanding the cultural systems or symbolic meanings behind it. This created a very distorted image of the region, which continued even after independence. Under British rule, history has become a tool of administration. The colonial officers documented the land, taxation, alliances, and rebellions, all with written reports. However, these records became the primary sources for later historians. But what do these records ignore? They ignored the oral testimonies of resistance, migration stories, clan histories, ecological knowledge, and spiritual worldviews. Thus, the written archive of the Northeast was already incomplete and biased before the historians even began to use it. The Kuki Rebellion of 1970 to 1919 is a very clear example of this. The colonial records framed it as a mere disturbance or law and order problem, but the Kuki oral traditions remember it and the struggle for autonomy and dignity. Two completely different histories, depending on whose voice we listen to. After independence, one might think that the nationalist historians would correct these colonial distortions. However, even nationalist histories often remained mainland centric and Sanskritic in orientation. It tried to build a unified national past, but in doing so, it frequently assimilated or ignored the regional diversity. Northeast India was portrayed as peripheral, a space of exceptions, or reduced to administrative categories like tribe, hill people, or borderland. This process of homogenization erased the complexity of its histories. The later schools like Marxism or subaltern studies tried to recover the marginal voices. They gave an emphasis on class, labor, and resistance, which shifted away from the elite narratives. However, even these schools could not fully engage with the ethnic and cultural specialities of the Northeast. The distinct histories of indigenous communities, their worldviews, and their relationship with land and memory were still largely. Another key issue is the concept of time. Conventional history demands dates, sequences, events, chronologies. But many communities in Northeast India do not record history with dates. They might remember the past through ritual calendars, agricultural cycles, migration routes, and ancestral landscapes. For example, a community may not say, "We migrated here in 1780." Rather, they might say, "When the river changed the course, our ancestors moved to the hills." Such a memory is rich in ecological and cultural meaning. But it does not fit into our linear framework of conventional history. Thus, mainstream historians often dismiss these accounts as vague, unscientific, rather than learn how to interpret them on their own terms. For many indigenous groups in the Northeast, the land itself is an archive. The mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the sacred groves are not just physical spaces, they're carriers of memory. Stories are attached to specific locations, rituals reenact certain ancestral events, and genealogies are performed orally during community gatherings. This form of history is embodied, special, and performative, but not textual. As conventional history privileges the written word, it overlooked this landscape-based memory. The combined effect of these factors is that a history of Northeast India, which you find in textbooks and archives, is very often partial, fragmented, or externally constructed. It records the wars, the treaties, and the administrative boundaries, but it very rarely captures the indigenous knowledge systems, the cosmologies, the kinship structures, the oral epics, role of women, or the relationships with the environment. This also has real world implications, like cultural erasure and identity conflicts, misunderstandings between the state and the local communities. Policies were based on incomplete or incorrect historical assumptions, and it created a sense of alienation from national history. Fortunately, the recent scholarship has begun to recognize these gaps. Historians and anthropologists are starting to engage with oral histories, indigenous narratives, and community memory. A call is now growing that historiography should be decolonized. The dominance of written archives have to be questioned, the multiple forms of knowledge have to be respected, and communities have to be allowed to speak for themselves. As Linda Toohey Weiss Smith argues, decolonizing history is not just about adding new sources. It's about transforming the very framework of historical inquiry to include relationality, memory, performance, and spirituality. Thus, the context of Northeast India reveals the central problem of conventional historiography. When history is defined too narrowly, entire worlds of memory are lost. To truly understand the past, we have to broaden our sources, our methods, and our imagination. As we conclude this session on conventional history writing and its limitations, let's briefly reflect on what we have explored so far. Conventional history is shaped by academic norms and archival research. It has given us some valuable tools like critical analysis, source verification, chronology, and structured narratives. It has helped in creating history transform into a recognized discipline and taught us to ask questions, examine evidence, and avoid mere speculation. However, as discussed, this approach has its limitations. Traditional historiography often privileged the written over the spoken, the state over the community, the elite over the ordinary, and political events over everyday experiences. Because of this, many voices were left out. The experiences of women, indigenous communities, peasants, laborers, oral societies rarely appeared in official archives. If something was not written down, it was assumed to have no history. But the absence from the archive is not absence from the past. We have learned that conventional history relies on the idea of objectivity and assumes that historians can stand outside the past and interpret it neutrally. However, historians were also shaped by their own context, their own positionalities, and the power structures of their time. History is not just what happened, it is also what is remembered, recorded, and allowed to be written. Recognizing the limitations of conventional history is not about rejecting it. It's about expanding it and allowing other forms of knowledge to enter the conversation. This helps in creating space for oral traditions, indigenous narratives, memory and storytelling, local knowledge systems. When we acknowledge the multiple ways of knowing, we make history more inclusive, more ethical, and more human. The future of history is not confined to archives and institutions. It has to be a space where diverse voices coexist, where written records meet the lived experiences, and where academic history learns from community memory. Only when we widen our lens beyond conventional history do we begin to see not just the history of power, but the history of people. Thank you.